This meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're gonna start tonight really as another turning point within the Gospel of Mark as we come to Mark chapter 11. So this has been this journey that we've been taking. Really, the first half of the gospel was devoted to this question: who is Jesus? Who is this one who comes? And we're told right off the bat that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. But he comes doing miracles of healing. He does miracles of driving out unclean spirits. He teaches in parables, and all of this causes amazement, so that people are wondering, who is this? Who is this that even causes the wind and the waves to obey what he says? And these questions that are throughout that first half really is there, and we begin thinking, could this possibly be the Messiah? Could this be the one that's promised by God to come and to deliver his people? And then in chapter 8 there was that key turning point when the disciples are on the road and they begin discussing about who Jesus is. And Jesus says, well, what are the rumors out there? And, some say you're one of the prophets, maybe Elijah or John the Baptist come back to life. And Jesus says, well, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And then Peter answers and says, you are the Messiah. Well, that leads into this whole other understanding, as Jesus tells him right away, okay, don't tell anyone. And that leads to the passion predictions that really had led that whole middle section in chapters 8, 9, and 10. We had the 3 passion predictions. Basically, what was that? What did they say would happen? In the passion predictions, we see that Jesus will
die.
He's going to die. And before that, he will
be tortured,
experience some torture or suffering, and maybe mockery. So he's going to be mocked and suffer, and then he's going to die. And then there is the third element usually in those passion predictions is
resurrection.
Resurrection. So he does those 3 different times. We are given passion predictions. Each time it's followed up by misunderstanding on the part of the disciples that shows that they don't get it. Whether they, in one case, rebuke Jesus and say, no, that's no way. In others, they're arguing over who's the greatest. And then, as we saw in the last episode, it was disciples kind of trying to jockey for the seats in the kingdom, one to sit on the right and the left. And so these questions of who is the greatest, and Jesus says that his calling as the Messiah and the calling of his disciples involves 2 things. One is suffering, and that means that people that follow him will also experience suffering as they're called to take up a cross. They're called to take up the cross and follow him. So there's self-denial and this idea that this is not about glory in the sense that we're typically thinking about it, and the way that they typically thought the Messiah was going to be in glory was not. It was a journey that involved the cross. And then the second thing that was really key in that section was it also involves service, because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And his disciples are also called not to serve. They are called to serve. I mean, not to be concerned with who's the greatest, but they're called to serve. And that is the definition of really true greatness within the kingdom of God, are those who serve. So that was kind of led up then to the end of chapter 10. We saw how that whole section was bracketed by the 2 healing miracles of the blind individuals, one at the beginning, who it was kind of the 2-stage process, and then blind Bartimaeus, who is healed, and he recognizes who Jesus is and then follows him on the way, which is with the calling of all disciples. And so it's pretty neat how those 2 stories bracket that section. Well, that brings us then to chapter 11. As we get into chapter 11, throughout these passion predictions, Jesus has had his destination in sight. And that destination is where?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. And so in this chapter, we're going to reach the destination. This chapter begins what we would associate with the events of Holy Week. So these are the final events of Jesus's life, that final week that leads up to the cross and ultimately to Easter. And so we will be making that journey together. And we'll begin with chapter 11, and we'll look at the first 11 verses. If someone would read that.
I will.
Thanks, Martha.
Now, when they came near Jerusalem to Bethphage and Bethany and at the Mount of Olives, he sent out two of his disciples, and he said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and as soon as you have entered it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has sat. Loose it and bring it. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it here." So they went their way and found the colt tied by a door outside on the street, and they loosed it. And some of those who stood there said to them, "What are you doing loosing the colt?" So they spoke to them just as Jesus had commanded, and they let them go. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their garments on the road, and others cut down leafy branches from trees and spread them on the road. Then those who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And Jesus went into Jerusalem and into the temple. So when he had looked around at all things, as the hour was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate that. And so as we come into the first part of this chapter, we're told they're approaching Jerusalem. So we're getting close. So that city that has been the destination is getting really close. And then it mentions two villages, Bethphage and Bethany. And that both of these are villages that were near the Mount of Olives. And so he's getting very close then to Jerusalem, and these cities that are associated with the Mount of Olives point to that. Both of these are two small villages that are on the way from Jericho, and Jericho was where he was when he held Bartimaeus at the end of chapter 10, and this would be cities on the journey to Jerusalem. And so he's probably, since these villages are kind of on the Mount of Olives, it's this idea that he already can probably see the city ahead of him, and he and his disciples are there within sight of the city. And when he gets there to one of these villages, we're not really actually sure which village it was, but he was in one of these villages, and he sends them to the village ahead of them and the other one. And he sends two of his disciples. And did you notice he gives them really kind of in-depth direction? They're very considerable detail in those directions. So what is it that they have to do?
Go get the colt.
So they have to go get a colt, and there's some things that are, first of all, they have to go. And so they
Right.
got to go, and as soon as they go into it, then they'll find this colt. What else are we told about this colt?
It's tied and no one sat on it.
It's going to be tied up and no one sat on it. Is there, why do you think that detail about no one sitting on it might be mentioned?
It's pure.
It's pure. It's never been sat upon. So that
Right.
would indicate that. So in one sense, this was a sense of, if it hadn't been sat on, then it's something reserved for royalty. There is this idea that this could be seen as something that was royal. So it's never been ridden, and so they're to untie it. And then what do?
If anyone asks why they're doing that, he's to bring it to Jesus.
So they're to bring it to Jesus. And then
Then
the
if
question, right?
anyone asks, why are you doing this?
Yes.
And you tell them the Lord needs it.
So Jesus anticipates that there's going to be some questions. Hey, why are you doing this? And Jesus is like, just say this. Like it's no big deal. Just say this. And so they're supposed to say the Lord needs it. And then it seems to be he's going to use it and then he's going to send it back. So he'll send it back, and we get Mark's word immediately a couple times in this section here. So Jesus is going to use it, and as soon as he's done with it, it'll be sent back. And so the Lord is interesting that he uses that word there, because in one sense, Lord can sometimes mean sir. But Lord also is the way in which God was referred to. And so there's this sense in which he's really pointing, I think, to the fact that he is more than just a human being, that he is actually the Lord. He is God as well. And so Jesus tells them. So he anticipates all this and tells them in considerable detail. And then this is one of those times when the disciples, they do a good job, right? They do exactly
They
what
paid
they're told.
attention.
Yeah. So they evidently did. We're not sure which two disciples this was, but they do exactly what they're told. The description of what they do matches exactly what Jesus has said. They go, they find the colt, they untie it, they resolve the objections of people like, hey, why are you doing this? By saying that the Lord has need of it. And they bring the colt to Jesus. Interesting is that they allowed them to take it too. So there wasn't, oh, well, who's the Lord and who's this? But they
You read my mind.
huh?
You read my mind.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? There's something about it that maybe they had some knowledge and heard of Jesus, but for whatever reason, when they're told that this is what Jesus said, hey, you go, and they take it, and they go. What do you think this whole thing about the way in which Jesus, first of all, discloses these instructions to his disciples, and kind of the fact that he anticipates all this? What do you think that says about this whole upcoming entry into Jerusalem?
I'm curious about what word he used for the Lord who needs it.
Yeah, the Lord it's the word kurios in Greek, which is the standard word that means Lord, like Lord is in God in many cases, but there are instances where that's also referring to like a Lord as in like a master, or it could be like even sir sometimes. So it kind of has different connotations, but the way it's used here seems to indicate that it's saying a little more than just he's the master. It's saying he's the Lord, I think.
The big guy.
Yeah.
Well, I think, getting back to your, I think, question,
Mhm.
he sends them to get a colt, not a big white stallion.
Mm-hmm. So that's significant. Just the animal itself is significant. And why is that animal? Why do you think that's significant?
Well, he didn't want to come in like a king. He was-
Yeah. Basically, what you normally would expect if someone's entering the city in a triumphant way, should we say, you'd be riding a war horse, right? That's what you would expect. And so the fact that he chooses this animal is significant in the fact of what that means is that this is not a war horse. This is a donkey or a colt, which indicates it's an animal of humility, which really goes along with what Jesus has been talking about throughout this gospel. It goes right into what he has been talking about service and taking up the cross and all that leading up to this, and will certainly lead into what Jesus talks about as he continues on his journey. So first of all, the fact that it is a weak animal, it's an animal of peace, which ties into another factor about the animal. There's another significant thing about this animal in particular. Anything else that might be significant about the donkey?
Well, one thing I was thinking about is donkeys is what kids would. You might be thinking about them.
Yeah, he might be, which would be a more humble idea. And he's
Mhm.
talked about that children in the past. But there's also another element here, and that is the fulfillment of prophecy. If you think about Zechariah, chapter 9 talks about the fact that the king would come riding on a donkey, and that is in Zechariah 9:9. And there it talks about how he will be the king of peace. So that all kind of ties into this idea of this is that. So I think we have with the cult then a lot of symbolism because of the nature of that. So that's an excellent observation. So first of all, the animal shows us a lot. What else about these preparations and the way in which it takes place? What else does that kind of tell us about Jesus and his entry here?
Well, he knew it was going to be there.
So it tells us a little bit something about Jesus, right? That he
Yeah.
has foreknowledge, right?
Mhm.
Which seems to indicate some sort of divine insight. So the fact that Jesus has this divine insight shows us he knows what's going to happen, and so there's this real sense that he's in tune with the future in some way. He knows exactly where this cult's going to be. He knows what needs to be said in order to secure it. And all that. So yes, I think that is an important element as well. So it shows us Jesus's foreknowledge or foresight into this. What else does that say? The fact that Jesus knows it. What else does that say about Jesus?
It's
That he's
fulfilling
God.
prophecy.
He's fulfilling prophecy. Someone else said something else too. I didn't hear. Did you say something, Pauline?
Well, I said he knew because he was God.
So that points to his status as God and the Lord, which indicates
Yes.
that Lord might mean something more than just a normal master. The other thing it really points to with that idea is Jesus knows what's going to happen, and he willingly accepts this. So that's an important element of this, is that he knows it, meaning that he knows even likely what's happening beyond that. And he has demonstrated that right through his passion predictions. He knows what's in store, and yet he still sets the plan in motion. I think that's an important part of it, is that Jesus accepts the plan. He accepts what is in store for him, which means by this action and beginning this journey into Jerusalem in this way, he's setting in motion the things that will happen that will ultimately lead to the cross, which really also shows us that this, the other thing that this demonstrates, the fact that Jesus says all these things, is this is all part of a divine plan. None of this is happening by accident. This is all part of the divine plan that that God has kind of ordained and orchestrated in order to bring about salvation. And so that that also is pointed to by the fact of the way in which this whole story is set up. There's a whole lot happening here. So so the disciples go, they get it, they bring it back. And then what happens when they bring it back? That picks up in verse 7. So what happens then?
They threw their garments on it.
Yeah. So Jesus has kind of been the one driving the action up to this point. They did what he told him, what he told these disciples to do. And now they start taking initiative, and the first thing they do, the disciples, is they throw their cloaks or their garments on it.
And then the
And
branches,
Jesus then sets on it. And then what happens?
they,
Get the branches.
So we have two parts there, Keith. One is they do take the branches. And what else do they take?
Their garments and put them
Yeah.
in the road.
So you have some folks that took their garments. So you have the disciples that put theirs on the actual colt. Then you have the crowd that puts them on the road, kind of to pave the way for Jesus. And then you have the leafy branches that they had also cut. One of the interesting things is We call this Palm Sunday, but Luke actually doesn't mention palms. That's mentioned in, I think, John's gospel, but this gospel doesn't actually say specifically palms. So we could call it Leafy Branch Sunday if it was based on Luke's.
Well, but palms are the kind of tree that was there
Yes, most likely that would be
mostly.
the case. So they've cut those, and then we begin being told what they said. But first of all, I think these actions of the garments and the pathway for this man. So they first of all they decorated the animal, which decorating the animal is kind of like that's the kind of thing you would expect when you're coming into a city, kind of on this victorious march in a triumphant way. You'd want to have your animal kind of decorated. Then the leafy branches, all these are gestures of the way in which you would want to welcome a powerful figure. And so they're seeing Jesus as this powerful figure who is coming to Jerusalem. And it really recalls other entries that had happened into Jerusalem as leaders came to take possession. For instance, Simon Maccabeus, talk about the Maccabean rebellion and the time that was about 150 years before Jesus or so. When he came in and he freed Jerusalem. And it says that they entered it with praise and palm branches and hymns and songs, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. And so just these actions themselves are going to start igniting some kind of revolutionary fervor, some expectation that, hey, this Jesus guy, he's coming in to turn things around. Maybe this Jesus is coming in to do what Simon Maccabeus did when he purified Jerusalem and brought freedom and independence to the city. And maybe Jesus is going to drive out the Romans and bring an independence here. And so these expectations, because of those kind of parallels, are certainly in the air. And the other thing is, because of the way the disciples and the crowds act here, it's clear that they have missed all of Jesus's teaching up to this point, which had talked about his purpose for his journey to Jerusalem. His purpose to come into Jerusalem is to be mocked and killed and ultimately rise from the dead. But they have missed what the true purpose of this was. This was not about Jesus coming in to fight the Romans or fight the Jewish religious leaders even. He's coming in to actually die. And so they've missed that part of the story. And that is demonstrated in the acclamations that they make as well. So what do they shout?
Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Hosanna. We like to sing the songs about Hosanna, and we even say it in our communion liturgy here. But this idea of Hosanna, does anyone know what that word means?
Praise.
Save now.
Save now. Yeah. So this is a word about salvation. It's to save now. So it's a cry for salvation. It's grant us salvation is the idea here. And so they're crying out salvation, salvation. And in our practice, it has become kind of this acclamation of praise. But they were seeing this then as a salvation. The word and this whole verse there in verse 9, where they say Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Both of that comes from Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26. Which is a psalm celebrating kind of God's entry into Jerusalem. And I think it's demonstrating that they really are expecting this restoration of the kingdom of David. And that's clarified in verse 10, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. So they think Jesus is going to come in and his plan is going to be to restore the kingdom of David. Well, the truth is that we know that Jesus has already kind of brought the kingdom in. He's brought it in through the way in which he's driven out demons and he's healed the sick and he's taught with authority, and his ultimate throne is going to be a cross. So his kingdom will really come in its fullness when he's nailed to the cross. It's not the deliverance that they expect. They really expect him to restore and establish this kingdom, but it's not going to be restored or established in the way they expect. It's going to be established through rejection and death and suffering. And so all of this, it's interesting because we often, and I'm often guilty of thinking of Palm Sunday as they're welcoming Jesus into the city. But actually the truth is that all of that kind of happens outside the city, because in verse 11 is when he finally gets to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So all that's happened. He goes into Jerusalem, and it's really kind of an anticlimactic kind of entry, isn't it? Jesus goes in, and it's almost like the way Mark tells it, he alone enters. We're not told that his disciples were there in verse 11. It says he entered Jerusalem, and he goes directly into the temple. So this is hardly a triumphant entry. No words are spoken. Nothing is said. It's kind of this eerie kind of silence. And what does Jesus do?
Looks around.
Yeah, Jesus goes in, he looks around, and he leaves.
He's the place out.
Yeah, maybe scoping it out. Yeah, that's kind of like the idea, right? But it's interesting. He goes in, he looks around at everything, and he leaves. There's one other thing. So he surveys the temple. I think what's interesting here is that Jesus's entry into Jerusalem at this point is not really about the city of Jerusalem itself. His interest lies in the temple, and that's where his initial interest lies here. And so why is that? And what is Jesus going to show us by this interest in the temple? And so he sees it. And that word see, we often like, oh, he looked at, but to see something is to really, sometimes, see can mean to examine it and to really kind of observe it. And so I think that's what Jesus is doing. He's observing the temple and examining it and looking out. But there's an interesting phrase that Mark includes there. Did you catch what else Mark says in that verse where he enters Jerusalem? He looks around.
At everything.
hour was late.
So the hour was late. I think that's an interesting phrase because in one sense, that probably means it's evening, right? It's too late. It's too late in the evening to really do much else other than look around. But is there another sense in which Jesus is saying it's late, or Mark is saying it's late?
Yeah.
Maybe it's late for the temple. Maybe the temple's time is past. Maybe it's too late for the temple. It's possible. That's a way we could see it in light of what's going to happen. And so maybe Mark is, with that language, maybe talking to us on a couple different levels. So Jesus goes back to Bethany at the 12. So he goes back to the village outside of the city. And so he comes into the city, he leaves, and he's with the 12 in this village of Bethany. Any observations or other questions that you'd like to bring up, or other things that you see there in those first 11 verses that you might like to point out or discuss?
He must have taken a good look at the temple, because my Bible says, so when he had looked around at all things.
Yeah. Translations will say all things are everything. So yeah, this is a fact that he looked around. It took some time, I think, right? This was not like just a casual glance.
So yeah, he must have been looking around and basically seeing how things were going on.
Yep, he wanted to see how things are happening at the temple.
In my footnotes, it says something about this is the same crowd that later says crucify him.
Yeah, so within a few days, we'll be changing the tune for sure.
I was wondering about verse 9 where it says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Is that not a reference to Messiah?
Yeah, certainly it is, right? I think the one who comes in the Lord's name. Yeah. So there's this idea in which they get it right at one level. but it's also the wrong expectation, I think, right, by their actions and the way in which they're seeing it. So I think there's always that interesting thing of, yeah, and it's the same way when Peter said, yeah, you're the Messiah, and then Jesus is like, okay, but understand what this means. And so I think it's the same thing here, that Jesus kind of is going to say, yeah, but wait. So I think they really want the more triumphal entry that Jesus doesn't really give. All right. So can have a lot of Palm Sunday sermons in the passage, but let's look at the next section, which is 12 through 25. If someone would read that.
I will.
Thank you, Susan.
Now the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. So they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry any wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. And when evening had come, he went out of the city. Now in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." So Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God, for assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be removed and be cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will come to pass, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them." And 25, did you say? "And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you your trespasses."
So this is just an observation that doesn't have much bearing on this whole passage. Some of your Bibles will have verse 26 and some of them don't. So
Mine doesn't.
the reason is that this is one of those kind of verses that some ancient authorities, ancient texts have and some don't. And so the translators make kind of these judgment calls of which one was accurate. And normally they'll put the options in a footnote. So that's what we have in a lot of the translations in verse 26. There's a footnote after verse 25. But I don't think that changes the meaning of what is here. So we'll talk about it as we go. But first, so as this section opens up, it's the next day. So Jesus came in to the city. He looked around, and the next day, they're on their way from Bethany, and Jesus is hungry. I'm like, I wonder why Jesus didn't eat breakfast back there. But anyway, he's hungry. So I kind of like this fact that Jesus is hungry because it kind of points to that kind of human side of Jesus as well. But here he is. He's hungry. And he sees in the distance a fig tree. What are we told about the fig tree?
He went to see if he could find something on it to eat.
So he went to see if he could find anything on it. Why does he think maybe he will? What's it have?
Leaves.
It has leaves.
Leaves.
Yeah, it's in leaf, it says. So he sees this fig tree leaves, and he goes to see if he could find anything on it. And he comes to it, and what does he find?
Just
Nothing.
leaves.
Okay, but leaves.
Leaves. He sees
More
leaves,
leaves.
he finds leaves, and there's no fruit. And Mark makes an interesting observation at the end of verse 13. He found nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs.
I always
Um,
thought that was strange. that
Yeah.
sentence.
So why
That
does Jesus
part.
expect to find it? And then that makes what happens next a lot odder too, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Because he says to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." So Jesus seems a little kind of harsh, maybe over the edge, because it's not even the season for fruit. And here he is saying, kind of basically condemning this fruit tree to never having any fruitfulness. And so the point here is that Jesus sees something that has the external signs of good health, but it's bearing no fruit. So that's an important thing here. External signs of health, but bearing no fruit. Another thing that's kind of interesting in the language that Mark uses is when it says it was not the season for figs. In one sense, season can mean season. It's not the, like we have a season when things are grow, and when fruit comes, and harvest seasons and all these things. So you expect certain times, but it can mean that, like season of the year, but it also can mean an opportune moment. And it's often used to say the time for God's action. For example, Jesus said in that kind of initial sermon that he gave in chapter 1, verse 15 of this book of Mark, Jesus said, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom is at hand." That word is the same word that's used here. It's the season or the time that is fulfilled. So is what Jesus is saying is that this is not it's not the time for figs as well, meaning it's not God's opportune moment for action, because things aren't in place for this fig tree to be used by God. So it's a possibility. What do you think? We're not told at this point really what any of this means. We have an episode here, which is another example of the Markan sandwich. So you remember how we talked about Mark likes to introduce something, and then he'll go on, and Jesus will do something else, and then Mark comes back to that. And so what we're going to see is that he starts this narrative here in verses 12 through 25 with the fig tree. Then Jesus goes on into Jerusalem, and then at the end, Mark comes back to the fig tree and kind of explains exactly what's happening here. So the key is that Jesus finds this tree. It has the signs of good health, but it's bearing no fruit. And then Mark makes one more remark at the end of verse 14. What else does he tell us?
The disciples heard it.
So the disciples heard it. Just an important note that the disciples saw this and heard it. So Mark wants us to know that they heard Jesus's words against the fig tree. So Jesus comes to Jerusalem in verse 15, and he goes where he had went the night before. He enters into the temple. The evening before, he had gazed around at everything. And today he actually goes into action right away. You see all the verbs here. He began to do what?
Drive them out.
So he's driving out, and we see all the different ones that he's driving out, right? Those who sold and bought. He's overturning tables, the tables that belong to the money changers, and he's overturning the seats of those who sold doves or pigeons.
And he was teaching.
And he's teaching in verse 17. The other thing he does in verse 16 is doesn't allow anyone to carry anything. It can be translated anything, but it could be any vessels. Probably the vessels that were used for worship and sacrifices, those weren't able to be used throughout the temple. so all of this is very significant because he's overturning these tables. He's driving out these folks that are buying and selling. All of these are things that were essential to the running and the functioning of the temple. The money changers, they did just what they said. They exchanged money. Why did they have to exchange money?
Take a profit.
Well, they did make a little money off of it.
Yeah.
People
Why?
came from all different countries, nations, and they wouldn't have the right money. But also, I think the temple had its own form of money, so even local people would have had to change regular money into temple money.
Yeah.
Sure.
There was a specific type of money that could be used to in the temple to pay your temple tax and to do all that. And the significant thing about this money was it didn't have the image of anybody on it. So the coins that were used throughout the rest of the empire would have had someone's face on them, the image of whether it was an emperor or other leaders. And of course, for Jewish people, that would have been seen as kind of idolatry or graven images. And so they didn't allow that. And so it had to be exchanged into the monies that they used in the temple, which did not have the human faces on it. And so they were making the money available and maintaining the purity of the temple. That's kind of the idea, is that they, in some ways, were doing a service to keep the law. And that's what they saw. So that's the other thing. The other thing is by driving out those who are buying and selling, and specifically overturning the seats of those who sold doves, this is also messing with the sacrifices and the offerings. And the sacrifices and the offerings that were essential to religious life in the temple. You had to be able to buy and sell these goods so that you could offer and sacrifice the animals that to meet those obligations. And when it specifies doves or pigeons at the end of verse 15, this is the poorest and the humblest of offerings. So even those offerings are being shut down. And so I like to think of this in relevant language for today, is that Jesus creates some supply chain issues here, because that's what he's doing, is he's cutting off the supply chain of the temple. He's making it impossible for the Jewish people to change their coins, so they're unable then to enter the temple precincts without impurity. And he is not allowing the things to be sold so that sacrifices and offerings can take place. And that when he says in verse 16, he wouldn't allow anyone to do these things. It's Jesus is the one calling the shots now. He's when it says he's the one allowing it or not allowing it, he's the one who says this is allowed in the temple and this is not allowed in the temple. And so the impact here of all this is that all the activity in the temple, all the activity in the religious center of Israel comes to a screeching halt. You often hear this referred to as the cleansing of the temple, but Jesus is not cleansing the temple. Jesus is shutting it down. Jesus is shutting the temple down. And he begins to then explain his actions in verse 17 as he begins teaching. And he draws our attention to actually some Old Testament verses. Do your Bibles tell you, or do you know where those verses are from?
Isaiah 56:7 and then Jeremiah 7:11.
Yeah, and both of these are these Old Testament prophets. And in the first one from Isaiah, it's interesting that Jesus kind of puts the word in the Old Testament in the prophet Isaiah. This is God, Yahweh, speaking to his people. And he kind of puts those words of Yahweh on his own mouth in a sense, and basically says that the temple is my house. And what does he say about his house?
A house of prayer for all
So
nations.
first of all, it's a house of prayer. So it's to be a house where we communicate with God. and that's to be at the center of what the temple or the house is about. And then the second thing is it's for all nations, all nations, not just the Jewish people, which is how it was currently functioning, but for every nation. And that reminds us of the whole promise to Abraham way back in the beginning, that he was to be the father of the nations, and through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And then, you know, as as God reminds Israel during the wilderness wanderings that they are called to be a light to the nations, and the prophets continually are calling them to do that. So he reminds them with the words from Isaiah, and these were words that were spoken there by the prophet at a time when it was an expectation or a fulfillment, because those words were actually given during exile, that this would come about to fulfill the purpose of the temple. But then the second part of it comes from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah chapter 7 is this section of Jeremiah that are called the temple sermons. And people were kind of relying on the temple as kind of almost in a superstitious way. And they were like, well, as long as we're in the temple, it's safe and it's secure because this is the temple of the Lord. It doesn't matter how we live. We can come in and offer our offerings. The rest of the week, we can do whatever we want, but we come in and offer these offerings, and we can be forgiven of all of our transgressions. And, you know, it's the temple, and God will never allow judgment to come against his temple. And they were saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And Jeremiah comes along and says, well, maybe you shouldn't find your trust there. Your trust should actually not be in the temple, but in the Lord of the temple. And so he emphasizes that. And he says, you have actually made my temple a den of robbers. And the way in which they had done that was they had allowed injustice. They were all concerned about their religious acts, but they weren't looking out for other people. And the leaders were not looking out for the common folks and making sure that their needs were taken care of. And always, particularly in the prophet, it was always the orphans and the widows and the foreigners. None of them were being looked after. And so Jeremiah says, you're basically hypocritical, and you've made this house into a den of robbers. So what's interesting is the you in verse 17, we're not yet sure exactly who Jesus is talking to when he says, you have made a den of robbers, but they make themselves known in verse 18. Who is it that Jesus might have been talking to?
The scribes and the
Priests.
chief priests.
Yeah, so we have the chief priest and the scribes. So the leaders of the temple, basically, and the temple aristocracy, and they're the ones who are to lead these religious functions, and they're the ones who are charged with kind of the legal side of matters of the scribes. So they heard it, and they kept looking now for a way to kill Jesus. Well, we had seen another group or two that wanted to kill Jesus. Remember back in chapter 3, 2 other groups had gotten together and said, we want to kill him. That was the Pharisees and the Herodians. And now we have the chief priests and the scribes on board. Can you see how everyone is coming in collusion to kind of make sure that Jesus is killed? But they're not going to do it yet. They're afraid of Jesus. And so it's not going to happen at this point. Why is it that they're afraid?
Because they want to be, I forget what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Basically, the people were following him. It says that
Yeah.
they were astonished at his teaching, but that was taking away from the chief priests and the Pharisees.
Yeah, they're losing their crowd with this teaching. And so the fact that they were afraid about the crowds, and if Jesus' popularity with the crowds, if they tried to kill him, that could backfire on them. So this was their concern. So that day, Jesus doesn't stay in Jerusalem, just as he did the night before. He leaves. So he and his disciples go out of the city. So now it's the next day. So we're to so this is the third day now. So the first day, the Sunday, the day of the entry, Jesus comes in, he looks around. Day 2, he comes in and he shuts down the temple. Now day 3, they're coming into the city. And what is it that Mark draws our attention to?
The fig tree.
So yes, the fig tree, that fig tree that we had seen. Here's the end of the Markan sandwich. So we had the one loaf of bread, then we had the filling, and that was the story of and the temple itself. And now we're back to the fig tree, which so we're here on the other side of the other piece of bread. So here, as they see the fig tree, he notes that it is withered away to its roots. So that what Jesus said about the fact that it's never going to bear fruit, that's come true already. So this is the fact is that that's very true. And so remember how Mark had drawn our attention to the fact that the disciples heard it. There's Peter. He remembered that Jesus had said that. And he said, Rabbi, look, the fig tree has withered. And then Jesus does something. He speaks. And he says that he doesn't really talk about fig trees, does he?
No,
What does he begin talking about?
have faith in God.
Yeah. He talks about faith. He talks about prayer. He talks about forgiveness. If you look at the themes that are in this next section here. It doesn't talk about a fig tree. So we're left to say, what is it that you think the fig tree represents?
From my version, it would be the snake, and then to have faith in God.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be people who don't
Believe.
produce?
Yeah, people who don't produce in one level. So those that don't produce fruit, which is a theme that Jesus talks about. What else in the context here? So he starts with the fig tree, he curses it. Then where does he go?
To prayer.
So prayers figures here, but so the day before this, he goes in the fig tree. He goes
Faith.
where?
Faith.
He goes into the temple.
Yeah, so that's right. So fig tree, temple, fig tree. What is it that's unfruitful other than the fig tree?
Having prayer.
Fruit. Producing fruit.
Producing
And
fruit.
what's not producing fruit?
The temple.
The temple. Yes. So
No prayer.
here's the fig tree, because it's not fulfilling its function, right? The function, it was called to be a place of prayer for all nations. The temple is not fulfilling its function. So that it's not bearing the fruit that it's been called to bear. So the fig tree, which as you read in the Old Testament prophets, it's in Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah, Joel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, and several places within the Old Testament prophets, that a fig tree is often used to represent Israel itself. But here, I think, is really specifically referencing the temple, that the fig tree that's not bearing fruit and cursed is as Jesus is going to the temple, that's a sign of what he's going to do when he goes into the temple. And the reason is that the temple has not produced the fruit that it's called to produce, which is to be a house of prayer for all nations, which is why then, after Peter asked about the fig tree, Jesus talks about prayer. And he talks about these things. And basically what he's doing here is saying how the prophecy of Isaiah 56:7 is going to be fulfilled. That prophecy that said, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. How will it be fulfilled? It will be fulfilled through faith. So no longer, in other words, what Jesus is saying, no longer do we look to the temple to be the place of prayer. We look to Jesus because he's become the place of prayer. He's become the temple. The house of Jesus, not the temple of Jerusalem, is what provides access to God for all nations. And it's about faith in Jesus. To Jesus's house will be a house of prayer for all nations. And believers are to ask the impossible. And it talks about this. It says, ask this, say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown in the sea. If you don't doubt in your heart, if you believe it, then it will happen. It will come to pass. When he says mountain, in one idea, he's talking about something impossible happening. But what else might he be referring to when he says mountain? This mountain. Problems. So that's a metaphorical idea that would certainly be a relevant application of this, is the problems or the burdens and the trials that we face. What else is on a mountain?
A tree sometimes.
Yeah, trees are on mountains. What? So fig tree, temple, fig tree. The other thing on a mountain is the temple. It's also the Temple Mount. When it's talking about this mountain, might it be talking about the Temple Mount? So the idea then that that the Temple Mount also says, you can say to this, this Temple Mount, in a sense, be removed and taken up in the sea, and it will come to pass, it will be done. So what Jesus is saying here is that it's no longer about the temple, it's about faith. It's about prayer that's offered through Jesus. And the third part of this is forgiveness. The issue that is at the heart of this is that prayer that comes from a believing heart, that's what fruit looks like. That's what the temple was meant to bring about. Prayer that comes from a believing heart in all the nations of the world. And what fruit looks like are prayers that come from believing hearts. And it doesn't matter anymore where the prayers are offered. It doesn't matter where you are. What matters is the heart with which those prayers are offered. The way and the heart in which those prayers are offered is important. So it's all about our union with God that's established through prayer. And that's established by faith in God that leads then those who believe into a situation where whatever we ask for will be granted, because we're asking in line with what God's desires are, because we're asking in faith. But there's one more element of this, and that is that Jesus insists, though, in this verse 25 and in verse 26, if you have a verse 26, he comes to what theme in this section, 25 and 26?
I don't have a 26.
Forgiveness.
It's forgiveness, right? So here's the thing, is that it's not just about our relationship with God is key. That's a key to being fruitful. But there also has to be the forgiveness between the believer and our neighbor, so that we are forgiving others.
Just
That
if you don't forgive,
our first
your Father
action in
won't forgive
prayer
you.
is to forgive, so that our Father in heaven, the Father of both the one praying and the one who needs to be forgiven, will forgive our sins. That's what we pray in the Lord's Prayer as well. Forgive, and we ask that, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, in the way that we often say it. And so here's the thing, is we're called to pray to God with a heart that is pure, a heart of forgiveness, a heart that has kind of done away with all hatred, so that we don't have any more hate and no more unforgiveness in our heart. We come to God with a pure heart. And so as we come to God with a heart of faith and a pure heart that has forgiven others, then we bear fruit. And so what Jesus is establishing here, and what he's going to make clearer as we continue our journey in the gospel, is that there is another way to God that is separate from the religious practices of the Jerusalem temple. there's a way of life that is marked by faith and prayer and forgiveness. It's through Jesus, the temple of Jesus, that we find the house of prayer for all nations. And so this theme of the new temple, this new way to God, is going to be really what emerges as we see the following conflicts between Jesus and the leaders of Israel. So do we have any thoughts or observations? This is kind of a challenging section, but also kind of a really encouraging section, because Jesus is reestablishing the fact that he is the way to God. It's no longer through the way that we thought it was. It's no longer tied to these temple functions and buying and selling and money changing. It's tied to the heart that is connected to God through Jesus. So in effect, Jesus is becoming the new temple here. Any other thoughts or observations? So as we will continue in the next couple weeks, we'll see that, so Jesus ends the kind of temple worship here. He's going to basically, in the next couple sections, also end kind of the role of the chief priest and the scribes and them as well. And then eventually he's going to say, oh, and by the way, the whole world is going to end in chapter 13. But guess what? We'll get a little more insight into the fig tree as well at that point. So we'll keep making this journey as we come next week then and look at these conflicts that he has with the religious leaders. Any final questions, observations, things we could clear up? Or insights you'd like to add? All right, let's